Rumors are circulating on Ukrainian social media that Russia has deployed a chemical weapon from the First World War known as lewisite. What is it? How much can we verify these claims? And what would it mean for the war? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. It's July 5th, 2023. This is your daily Ukraine update. Let's get into it. Okay, first, let's take a look. There we go. All right, first, let's take a look at the combat map. There's been a couple of changes, small but favorable to Ukraine since the last update. First is outside of Klitschivka, right, south of Bakhmut. Again, we're seeing that the most success the Ukrainian armed forces seems to have in this conflict is around Bakhmut. And again, not a tremendous amount of progress per se. In fact, Russian forces still holding on to these main defensive positions here, these wood lines. So it's really tough to say that even these are that this is substantive progress in any way. But they have been kicked out of this windbreak here. But the real challenge is going to be the last really defensive line, so to speak, outside of Klitschivka. This forested area here, this forested area to its south, and this smaller belt of forest here. Some of these wider areas are really tough to clear out simply because they, unlike these very narrow windbreaks, you can build fairly robust layered defenses in them. But nonetheless, it's a sign of continued progress. Up near the Burkiva Reservoir, you can see that, boom, right there. Again, Ukrainian forces counterattacking, pushing, trying to regain control of this area east of the reservoir. Of course, the final spot near Optine, here we go. You can see that, boom, Ukrainian forces liberating again a small strip of windbreak and crossing this small canal here, trying to keep Avdiivka, which is the site supposedly of some of the largest Russian attacks, trying to keep this clear and open, right? This has become a focus as the Chechen forces have been assigned to take over the offensive, and part of it is to raise Ramzan Kadyrov's stock. Probably part of it is simply a Chechen honor culture thing. They definitely don't want to. They want to at least prove that they are as capable as the Wagner group. But so far, again, their attacks are trending in the wrong direction. Okay, here's where things get even more worrisome, right? First, we could see in the control map or the combat map that Russian forces, again, really transitioning to the offense in 40 different instances, including heavily in the east, right? Again, here in the south, we're seeing far fewer deliberate offensive actions. But here's where things get worrying. Here's a symbol we haven't seen on the map before. This is a spokesman for the Tavria direction of the Ukrainian Defense Forces have claimed that Russian troops are using lewisite in combat. Now you can see here that this is fighting in and around Volodar, where Russia itself has put out a statement a couple days ago that Volodar was the site of some of the heaviest fighting. Which is strange because, again, that's not what we think of as being the prime directions that Ukrainian forces are operating in, right? They're generally operating outside of Staromayorsk and are pushing near Robotyne, right? So interesting that Russians would make some sort of statement to this effect, and then Ukrainians would come out and claim that lewisite was being used in combat. Now let's talk a little bit. Let's see if we can verify these claims, right? They are being reported by the Kiev Post. Right, it is being attributed to Ukrainian officials. So they said they are Russian artillery strikes near Bakhmut left Ukrainian soldiers with symptoms of chemical weapons exposure. Again, this is something Kiev is claiming, but so it is being reported by the Ukrainian government. A spokesman for the Ukrainian Defense Forces is rolling it out. They reported that it was against Ukrainian positions near Bakhmut. Soldiers showed symptoms including nausea, vomiting, and in a few cases loss of consciousness. Right. And he posted this on a social media site in a video attributing it to lewisite. But they also report that Ukrainian chemical warfare specialists are still evaluating the evidence and identification of lewisite as the chemical weapon used, and that they're reporting preliminary results. But These claims haven't been independently verified, but they are still going viral across Ukrainian media. Now, let's talk a little bit more about lewisite. And the Kiev Post actually does a pretty good job of talking about it. But what I think is important is to understand that chemical weapons are subject to the Chemical Weapons Convention, which is a convention on the prohibition of the development, production, stockpiling, and use of chemical weapons and their destruction, signed in 1997. Per the treaty, countries who held such weapons are obligated to commence verifiable or verified destruction of all chemical weapons other than small amounts to be retained for testing and development of defensive countermeasures, right? And this was supposedly all verified, and there's 193 signatories, including Russia. Now, here's the thing to remember, as they point out that the British government has said that the Kremlin has already definitively proven in a court of law violated this chemical weapons treaty by, at a minimum, the 2018 attacks against former KGB agent Sergei Skripal in Salisbury, right? The Kremlin, of course, denied wrongdoing, but it's worth noting that these Salisbury chemical attack timeline. Here we go. As you guys may recall, the Kiev actually launched a series of poisonings in the city of Salisbury, right? So this is on UK sovereign territory. But this is because a former Russian military officer and had defected or had been a double agent for the British intelligence agencies. He had defected with his daughter, and the two were poisoned, actually. Right, using a very, very advanced type of poisoning, right? A234, a suspected chemical weapon. The victims, of course, you had 3 admitted to the hospital and were subsequently discharged. Sergei and Yulia Skripal, a detective who responded to the scene. You also had these other people who were exposed were actually people who found the delivery device, which I think was a bottle of perfume or soap in the trash and used it themselves. But ultimately, let's see, this is the point of this is that this is something that is highly, highly against the Treaty on Chemical Weapons. And yet Russia oftentimes views these things as simply being political theater, and that they don't really have to abide by them. And frankly, given the lack of response by the international community in the face of this and the allegations that the Russian-backed Assad regime in Syria had used chemical weapons against civilians, it's no surprise that Russia feels emboldened to employ this chemical known as lewisite. What is lewisite? Here, let's try to get the full monitor so you guys can see. Lewisite is a type of, chemical warfare agent called a vesicant or blistering agent. This means it causes blistering in the skin and mucous membranes on contact. It's an oily, colorless liquid in its pure form, but can appear black in its impure form. It smells like geraniums. I don't think I could recognize what geraniums. And of course, it was produced in 1918 for use in the First World War, but it was actually produced en masse too late to be used in the war. It only exists as a chemical warfare agent. It has no practical use and cannot be found naturally in the environment. If you have been exposed to lewisite, right, it can be delivered as a gas released into the air where it can contact the skin or eyes, or it can enter the lungs while breathing it in. But in liquid form, it can be released into water, exposing a large number of people if they drink or bathe in the water. It can also come in contact with food. And of course, you can also just touch liquid lewisite itself. Lewisite vapor, like a lot of chemical weapons, is actually heavier than air, so it's highly likely to settle in low-lying areas. It can remain a liquid from below freezing to extremely hot temperatures, and so can persist for a long time in the environment. Now, based on animal studies, which is where we suspect most of the health effects, skin, it will cause pain and irritation within seconds, redness, and followed by blister formation several hours later. That it produces very large blisters and lesions. It also will, of course, irritate and cause tearing in the eyes, runny nose, sneezing, hoarseness, a bloody nose, sinus pain, shortness of breath, cough, diarrhea, nausea, vomiting, and something called Lewisite shock, or a sudden drop in blood pressure. But that's for a mild exposure. Severe exposure, right, can cause things like blindness. It can cause death. Can cause very severe respiratory failure. There's also, obviously, like any chemical weapon, it is certainly not meant to be. It's meant to cause harm. Now, how would it be used in warfare? But before we talk about that, I wanted to talk about combatvetnews.com. This is my site that I launched after Patreon kicked me off. You guys know YouTube also not the biggest fan of war content lately. Sponsors don't really want to touch this content, but I think the news about this is important. If you're one of my American or European audience members, your country, your tax dollars go to support this war. And so I try to bring you the analysis of what is going on. But if you want to support what I do, if you appreciate what I do, then you can become a member. Any one of these tiers gets you access to an exclusive room on the Discord and the members only content, which is my bi-weekly or so and analysis of the latest viral combat footage. This is the stuff, of course, I can't show you on any of the other sites, but it's the only way we can do analysis and really understand what's happening on the front lines. Our most recent video was of a Ukrainian minefield and how challenging and sometimes catastrophic it is to navigate these sort of high density fields. So if you want access to that, again, combatvetnews.com. Now, I just want to point something out, right? And this is, I'm not certain. So this is at least 2 reports, supposedly, of Russian troops deploying Lewisite against Ukrainian forces. Why would you do it in combat? Well, Lewisite can be effective in a couple of ways. First off, it can stop an advance dead in its tracks, because as soon as you've been exposed, you need to vacate the area. And if you're going to fight in this environment, you have to put on NBC gear, right? These are usually gear that protects, the gas mask, a full suit that is designed to block chemical weapons from entering. Oftentimes, you have a system of tubes where you can drink water from a water source without ever having it exposed to the outside environment. So it turns you into a sort of sealed, self-contained unit. But obviously, if you've already been exposed, you just have to get back. You just have to get away. The CDC actually has guidelines for how to respond if you believe you've been exposed to Lewisite. The short answer is get out of your clothes. Don't touch the outer portion of your clothes. If you can avoid it, cut them away from your body if you need to, and then wash with soap and water. Flush your eyes out for 10 or 15 minutes, then immediately seek medical attention. But what happens is that then if let's say you knew that let's say this was accurate. I don't think this is, but let's say this was where it had been deployed. What it could do, right? If the Russian forces dropped it right here, they would say, okay, we have maybe mined this road here, and now we are going to put Lewisite along the road so that it's going to force Ukrainian forces to move much slower. They're going to be in NBC gear. They're going to have to prepare to cross this contaminated area. They're going to have to cross the contaminated area under fire. And then once they're clear of the area, which they can only verify through testing, they're going to have to strip down, decontaminate, and continue offensive operations. But you can imagine how incredibly complex it would be to simply pass, say, resupply through here. Or let's say they took a casualty trying to clear this village. Now they have to put the casualty in an ambulance or a vehicle and then move that through this area. And then by the time they get to a medical casualty collection point, right? They would have to decontaminate the vehicle before treating the casualty. So you see how this chemical environment becomes incredibly challenging for an offensive force to operate in. As a defensive force, it's much easier because you simply deploy these chemical weapons forward of your lines. And if you have no intention of recapturing territory in the near future, then for Russia, this can be a very, very, very viable defensive strategy, even though it's fairly clear that Russian troops probably don't have gas masks, probably don't have high-level mop gear. They may have like this sort of stuff here, this old school, very old school. Let's see if we can find a good quality footage of it. We can't. But old school Soviet smocks, chemical warfare smocks. So basically, it's used similar to a minefield. It's used to canalize, force the enemy to turn and go in a different direction, slow the enemy, or block them from moving through a certain area. It is just, in many ways, it is vastly more effective than minefields. And just like minefields, right, it's sort of prohibited by treaty, but Russia believes these treaties are just theater and doesn't really respect them that much. Okay, anyway, guys, that's all I had for you for today. Of course, I'm going to stay on top of this story and talk to you guys about it tomorrow. Thanks so much to the members of CombatVetNews.com, our Colonel tier members. I appreciate you guys so much, and I appreciate all of our Lieutenant tier members. Your support really is what enables me to continue to do this every day. Thank you so much, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.